Hello and welcome to this program. Last time we took part in the search for Noah's Ark, and today we shall see how mankind again rose from the debris of the flood. The greatest flood in world history was slowly receding. And where did the water go? Well, some scientists believe that the continents had shifted, leaving gaps where the flood water became today's oceans. Noah's Ark had settled high in the mountain range of Ararat, and the water line kept creeping slowly down the mountainside. And the only survivors were Noah and his little family of 8. And they remained in the ark for another 2 months until the earth was dry enough to open the hatch and let the animals out. They must have been very short on food by this time. And Noah remained in the ark still for a long time. This was their shelter, and they feared another devastating flood. He built an altar and made an offering of thanks to the Lord. It was their first day in a new existence, in a new world. His forefather Adam had done the same when he was expelled from the Garden of Eden. He sacrificed to the Lord. And now God blessed Noah and said, "I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease." It was these 8 people who made a new start in a new and changed world. Everything they had known was gone, and they were desperately short of food. The fear of another devastating flood was on everyone's mind, and it made them reluctant to move away from the ark and down to the plains where the living conditions were better by now. They felt safe only when they were near the ark. One of the first things that Noah did was to plant a vineyard. And the mountainsides of Ararat are full of vineyards. And I have even heard about a village called where Noah planted the vine. Many of the trees have thick, twisted trunks, a testimony of long life under harsh conditions. There is an episode in Noah's life that marked the beginning of how this family slowly migrated into the wider world. One day Noah had had too much wine and ended up sleeping drunk and naked in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and went backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. So Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his younger son had done to him. And then he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brethren." And he said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servants." This event split the family, and Japheth and Ham now established new settlements for themselves, south and west of the mountain. The Book of Jubilees has the story. And Ham discovered that his father had cursed his younger son, and he did not like it. And therefore he separated from his father together with his sons, Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan. And then he built himself a city and named it after his wife. And Japheth saw this and became envious of his brother, and therefore he also built a settlement for himself and named it after his wife. Shem continued to live near his father Noah and built a city on his side of the mountain. He also named it after his wife, And behold, the cities remained near Mount Lubar. Shem's city was to the east of the mountain, Ham's city to the south, and Japheth's to the west. These three settlements were the first permanent buildings after the flood. And although they only included themselves and their children, they are called cities. They were still living close to the mountain, west, south, and east of the peak, and nobody had ventured into the lowlands. Noah was 600 years by now, and he was thinking about the future and the relationship between his sons, and this urged him to divide his inheritance between them. The whole earth was their inheritance, and he decided to divide it justly between his three sons. The earth had changed during the flood, and there was no point in using old names. And Noah must have known that to the north there was mostly ice. So he started from where his sons had settled and decided that all land in the same direction should belong to them, to the west, south, and east. Ararat was the center of the world for them, and Noah now imagined sectors drawn from this mountain. And geographers would call this Ararat projection. And we can even find it on a few very old maps. When Noah's children moved down to the plains in the south, it is said that they followed the rivers Euphrates and Tigris and settled in northern Mesopotamia and further down in Shinar later on. Many archaeological discoveries have been made in this area. And they are thought to be the oldest cultural sites ever, and they agree well with the biblical account of the earliest migration. One such excavation site is the ancient city of Carchemish, located at the upper part of the Euphrates. This city is mentioned several times in the Bible. The book of Jubilees states that the ark settled on Mount Al-Judi, and tradition confirms that this is the southern peak of Ararat. So it seems logical that the first settlements lay west, east, and south of the mountain, and the north was perhaps too cold. The first settlements lay close to the southern peak, and excavations in this area reveal that the earliest permanent dwellings were so-called beehive houses, made of stone and clay. A family tree for Noah and his children show that the population grew rapidly, and we see a growth of nearly 2.5% per year, which is twice today's rate. And the first settlements were made in northern Mesopotamia, but fairly soon they spread out into the plains further south. And we also find settlements from this period in the fertile valleys of the Nile and the Indus rivers. The world before the flood was different from today's world, but so were the living conditions after the flood. The lifespan of those who had been in the ark was about 400 years, but just a few generations later, this had dropped to about 150 years. We saw in an earlier episode that there are strong indications that 900 years before the flood represented an equal amount of time as the 120 years that Moses lived. Whether it was Japheth or Shem who was the oldest among Noah's sons is not clear. But in the Bible we mainly read about Shem's family. He was the one who stayed on with his father. Ham and Japheth were the first to migrate and set an example for their children. And many settled in the plain of Shinar. And they eventually became so many that God advised them to move on, because the land did not provide food for all. Then some started to think that the reason that God had dispersed them was to make them vulnerable to attack. And many now gathered around Ham's grandson, Nimrod. Nimrod was quite a character and founded a reign of terror. He was the first after the flood to establish a rule over the whole earth. And I shall say more about this in the story of Abraham. Nimrod decided to build the Tower of Babel, a building meant to reach through the clouds. According to Josephus, this tower was intended as a place of refuge in the case of another flood. And he described the project in this way. And they built a tower, neither sparing any pains nor being in any degree negligent about the work. And because of the many hands employed, it grew very high, sooner than anyone could expect. But the thickness of it was so great, and it was so strongly built, that its height, this great height, seemed upon view to be less than it actually was. It was built of burnt brick, cemented together with mortar of bitumen, so that it would withstand water. And when God saw that they acted so madly, he did not resolve to destroy them utterly, since they were not grown wiser by the destruction of their former sinners. But he caused a tumult among them by producing them in them different languages, so that they should not be able to understand one another. The place where they built the tower is now called Babylon, because of the confusion of that language which they readily understood before. For the Hebrews mean by the word Babel confusion. And after this they were spread out abroad on account of the languages, and went out by colonies everywhere. And each colony took possession of the land where God led them, so that eventually the whole continent was filled with them, both the inland and the maritime countries. Some also passed across the sea in ships and inhabited the islands. So far Josephus, and nothing seems to be left of this tower today. The story is that Alexander the Great ordered the remains to be removed. He wanted to rebuild the tower, but died before he could start the work. Through his 3 sons, Noah had 16 grandsons and probably the same number of granddaughters. They grew up and established places of their own, naming them after themselves, as was their custom. And this gives us good reason to believe that these people really existed. Many of these names are still in use. And after the Babylonian confusion, people relocated and settled in many different regions which they found suitable. And after the confusion of languages, they couldn't quite understand each other anymore. The historian Josephus has told us where many of them went. And they migrated both inland and along the coast. And soon people were living everywhere. And some built boats and sailed to the islands. So let's start with Japheth. He inherited the lands west and north of Ararat. His sons were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, and Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. And of course there were also some daughters. Japheth divided further the lands he had inherited between his sons. And when they all moved out soon afterwards, they must have had the desire to examine their inheritance. Japheth's children settled from the Taurus Mountains in the south to the Tanai River in the north, and west as far as Cadiz. The eldest son Gomer went to the regions of the north, and the people in the highlands of Turkey used to be called Gomerites. And the same was the case with the Gauls in the present-day Western Europe. So Gomer could eventually have traveled to distant France to see what he had inherited. And local history in Wales confirms that descendants of Gomer came to the British Isles 300 years after the flood. His sons were Ashkenaz, Ripa, and Togarma. And in ancient times, Turkey was called Togarma. And the neighboring Armenia claims its origins from Togarma and Ashkenaz. And Ashkenaz is a Hebrew word for Germany. The prophet Ezekiel claims that Gomer's brother Magog lived far to the north. The Greeks called Magog's children Scythians, and this was the name of an area stretched from Romania and Ukraine to the steppes east of the Ural Mountains. The Madai, along with Shem's son Elam, are considered the origin of the Iranians. Josephus wrote that Madai's descendants were called Medes by the Greeks. And when people from Media are mentioned in the Bible, the Hebrew word Madai is used. And these were the North Iranian people. And the next grandson of Noah was Javan. His name is the Hebrew word for Greece, and his children were Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. The Elysians must come from Elisha, and Tarsis or Taurus is found in Cilicia in Turkey. And Kittim is the biblical name for Cyprus, and Dodanim was the western coast of Turkey. The next is Tubal, and Ezekiel mentions him along with Gog and Magog. And Josephus calls them Tobalites, and they lived in the Caucasus regions around Georgia. To this day, the capital is called Tubal in the form of Tbilisi. And from here, many migrated north along a river they called the Tobol, up to Tobolsk, which is today a big city. The next son is Meshech, and his name is linked to the areas around Moscow. A part of this area is still called Lowland Meshera, unchanged from the ancient times. The last of Japheth's 7 sons was Tiras. Josephus writes that they were called Tiraseri and later changed the name to Thracians. And Thrace was the area between the Danube and the Black Sea, Bulgaria and the former Yugoslavia. The people of Thrace were known as warmongering Indo-Europeans, and their favorite pastime was fighting. But Tiras was a subject to ancestor worship, and his followers called him Turas, or Thor, the god of thunder. And the worship of Thor traveled far, as did the cult of his stepson Ul. And these cults were common in the Nordic countries for many centuries, until Christianity was introduced at the end of the first millennium. So Japheth and his children inhabited all the regions in the north. Then Noah's second son Ham settled in Africa and Western Asia, regions south of Ararat. And he had 4 sons, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. The name Ham is used in the Bible as a name for Africa. And Josephus says that Ham's kingdom stretched from Syria across the whole of North Africa and south to Ethiopia. The old kingdom of Ethiopia was called Cush after his eldest son. The next son was Mizraim, which is a Hebrew name for Egypt. And Put is the Hebrew name for Libya. And Josephus says that Put founded Libya. The youngest of Ham's sons was Canaan, which is the Hebrew name for Roman Palestine, including Israel and Jordan. And Noah's third son was Shem, and he had 5 sons, Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. And they settled in southern Asia, from the Euphrates to the Indian Ocean and beyond. Elam is an old name for Persia or Iran, and until the time of King Cyrus they were called Elamites. Assur is the Hebrew word for Assyria, and this was a great kingdom in Asia that lasted until the 7th century BC. It included parts of Iraq and Iran. Arphaxad gave rise to the Chaldeans in southern Mesopotamia, and through his son Peleg he had a grandson, Eber, from whom we have the name Hebrews. Another son, Joktan, had 13 sons who all settled in Arabia. Lud became the ancestor of the Lydians in the western part of Turkey, and their capital was Sardis, today's Salili. Aram is the Hebrew word for Syria, and the Syrians called themselves Arameans, and their language was Aramaic, and it is still spoken, but it was once the world language. The world population grew rapidly, and after the flood, God blessed Noah's family and said, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth." And different sources confirmed that they had many children. And it rained regularly, the sun was hot, and many hands were needed in the fields. Nimrod was born into the tribe of Cush in the year 257 after the flood. And at that time this tribe consisted of 460 adult men when Nimrod turned 40. And the world population had most likely reached 20,000 when Abraham was born. Some of the European national sagas trace their royal lines back to ancient history and make it possible to connect our time with the time of Noah's children. And from Iceland we have the royal saga by Snorri from the 13th century, and in England Nennius wrote Historia Britonum at the end of the 7th century. And both books have genealogical tables connecting our time with antiquity and the biblical genealogies. So from humble beginnings, mankind has gradually filled the earth and now exceeds 8 billion people. And we have come to the end of this program, and the next time we will end our journey with a visit to the patriarch Abraham from Ur. So thank you for watching. God bless you and goodbye.